Now, authorities in Gaza say that Israeli forces have fired on people as they were making their way towards an aid distribution site in Rafah, killing 27. The IDF says its troops fired on a group that posed a threat and had refused to retreat when warned to do so. Well, this is the third day of similar shootings after an Israeli and US-backed foundation established aid distribution points inside Israeli military zones, a system it says is designed to circumvent Hamas and stop them from stealing aid. The United Nations says this new system doesn't address Gaza's huge hunger crisis and allows Israel to use aid as a weapon. I'm pleased to say we can now speak to David Mencer, the Israeli government spokesperson. David, thank you for making the time to speak to us today. It's always good to speak to you. This situation, most recently in Gaza, 27 people said to have died. An investigation has been launched. It said that there was a threat. Can you tell us what that threat was?
Good to be with you. Let me just tell you first, on the Sunday incident, it's very important to understand that we've already released footage showing Hamas gunmen themselves shooting at their own people. Why do they do that? Because they're trying to hold on to this last grip of power, this last grip which they have over Hamas has over the people of Gaza, that of aid. Now, this aid should have been provided to Gazans people free. They have been charging, Hamas have been charging for this aid, extortionate prices. Why do they do that? They use the funds to recruit new terrorists and pay their existing terrorist fighters, but no more. The new Gaza Aid Foundation is specifically designed to take Hamas out of the equation, to provide boxes of food for Gazan families rather than sacks of flour, which are of no use to a family. A box of food for a week, which we're handing out. We've handed out millions and millions already to get Gazans people fed and removing Hamas from the equation.
Now, David, as you all know, that video is being disputed. Some online OS experts, people who were able to assess these kinds of videos, say that it is misleading and it may not actually be the position where the Israelis say that it is. That's the Sunday incident, and that was where 30 people were killed. I'm asking you specifically about the Monday incident, the one that we're reporting on now, and the 27 that were killed. The IDF have put out a statement saying that there was a threat. What was the threat as these people were walking towards this aid distribution site?
Well, I'll tell you very, very clearly. It was actually this morning, Tuesday, as crowds were moving along the designated routes towards a humanitarian aid distribution point in northern Gaza, our soldiers identified several individuals who moved away from the crowd, from the approved access route. Again, we're trying to get as many people as we can to give access to this food. They moved away, and this occurred about a kilometre away from the aid distribution site. Now, the Israeli army, they issued warning shots in the air, and still some of these suspects continued to advance towards the troops in a threatening manner. Still, further fire was directed close to them, but not to them, but they continued their advance. So we know very well about this report, but I must tell you again that we have released verifiable footage of Hamas gunmen themselves firing at Gaza.
David, yes, but the footage that you just alluded to from the incident on Sunday is disputed. It was not of the Gaza Foundation. Humanitarian Foundation site.
No, I don't agree with you. I don't think it's disputed at all. It's probably disputed by people that want Hamas to retain control of aid distribution. But we're not going to have that anymore, because that is their last vestiges
Let's talk about this incident on Tuesday. OK, David, let's talk about this incident on Tuesday. 27 people killed. You say there was a threat. Did they have weapons?
Well, you'll have to ask the IDF for the specifics.
I'm asking you. You're here to speak.
Right, and I'll tell you that the IDF is not preventing the arrival of Gazans at humanitarian sites.
That was not my question, David, as you well know. Did they have weapons, David?
It's precisely the opposite. We are encouraging it. Now, the warning shots were fired away from the aid distribution point in response to the threat perceived by IDF troops. Now, we are facilitating, using this independent operation of this NGO, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, specifically, precisely to ensure that aid reaches civilians and not Hamas. There have been many, many occasions of Hamas lying to international media, and unfortunately, international media repeating those lies, and that very often leads to dead.
We're not repeating any lies, David. I'm putting the questions to you, and as you well know, in recent weeks we have spoken to Hamas about this. This 27 that were killed, 3 children were killed, 2 women. Were they a threat as well?
Again, every bit of news which comes out of Hamas, of Gaza, is controlled by the terrorist organization. There have been many, I can read you
So we can't be trusted, is what you're saying?
No, I'm not. I'm saying that you need to verify. Do your jobs,
We'd
media.
love to, David.
We
we
are
would
not
love,
preventing
David,
Gazans
we
from
would,
accessing
as you know, David, and as
aid.
you and I have spoken about before, we would love to verify this, but international journalists are not allowed into Gaza, are they? Why not?
Well, I'll tell you very, very clearly what the reason is for that. Our priority is getting our hostages out. Not Sky's journalists in. That's our priority. That's what we care about. Now, real journalists enter Gaza with the IDF. Hamas journalists, unfortunately, never leave because they work with Hamas. And to be fair to those journalists reporting from Gaza, you won't be alive very long if you ever do produce any sort of output that is against Hamas, because Hamas will kill you. So many so-called journalists in Gaza, and of course we regret any journalists which have been killed, real journalists, but you know, Hamas operatives.
You're distinguishing between real journalists and fake journalists. The point is, David, journalists aren't allowed, from international organisations, are not allowed into Gaza either. And I'm asking you again why you don't allow that. Why don't the Israeli government allow journalists in? You'll know the charge that's put to the Israeli government is that they don't want the world to see what's really happening.
Again, so there's no shortage of output from Gaza. It's been on our front of our screens for 20 months now. But our priority is getting our hostages out.
You're not letting...
We want to get our live hostages out, not sending your journalists in. I will remind you that Hamas arrested a BBC journalist about 10 years ago, and they held him. And he was only released when there was an international outcry. And finally, Hamas released him. Now, that same outcry has not happened for our Israeli people being held hostage for more than 600 days now. Our priority is getting our hostages out, not sending your journalists in.
David, that's entirely misleading. You know that there has been international condemnation of the hostages that are still being held. It is untrue for you to make that charge. Right?
I'm not talking about condemnation in words. I'm talking about real action. When real pressure is put on Hamas, the terror organisation, things happen.
Well,
hostages are released.
You know
when they get stronger. I'll tell you when they get stronger.
There's a process that's on the way, and it's ongoing, as you know, and we'll come on to that in a moment, but I want to stick with these aid sites and distribution and the number of people who've been killed in recent days. Now, there are 4 aid distribution sites that are due to be set up under the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. How many of those sites are operating currently?
My information, which is as of this morning, is that they are operating well right now, and millions of aid boxes have been distributed to ordinary Gazans. And now,
how many
humanitarian aid that goes to Hamas is not humanitarian.
Which is why you said at the GHF. How many of them are operating?
That's why we're breaking the link. That's why we're breaking the link.
Okay, there are 4. That you were going to set up 4. It's reported that maybe 2.5 are operating well. Previously, the United Nations, before the blockade was brought in and the UN were expelled from working within Gaza, had 400 distribution sites. This current provision of aid is insignificant and it is not appropriate for the amount of people that need it.
So that's incorrect. Unfortunately, the UN have a vested interest in seeing Hamas remain in power. Many of the monsters of October 7th were UN employees. We know, of course, that they were in cahoots with the United Nations. At best, they look the other way. At worst, you know, every single monster that committed the atrocities of October 7th, they were graduates of a UN education. We're saying no more. If you want peace in Gaza, then remove the UN from the equation, remove Hamas from the equation, get the food directly to Gazan families, and then we can end this war. And of course, we know that the war will end immediately when Hamas lay down their arms and let our hostages go.
Will it, David? Because you'll know that reported just on the 12th of May, statements by the Prime Minister, who says that the inevitable outcome of the Israeli army's destruction of Gaza will be the forced expulsion of Palestinians. Benjamin Netanyahu said while speaking to the Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee that the only inevitable outcome will be the wish of Gazans to emigrate outside the Gaza Strip. So this idea that the release of the hostages will bring this to an end doesn't stack up with what is said by your own Prime Minister.
Again, so that's incorrect. Israel continues to explore and to promote the Trump plan, where we're talking about voluntary, not compulsory. The Prime Minister has never said compulsory. I sat with him many, many times. He's never, ever said compulsory. It is false reporting, indeed fake news.
So you make it as miserable as possible.
Not at all, not at all. The Trump plan is to enable voluntary departure of Gazans, and that negotiations are underway.
David? Where would they
go? If you allow me to answer the question instead of interrupting me, it's very rude what you're doing right now. Negotiations are underway.
I'm trying to get some answers from
if you allow me to answer the question rather than interrupting me, as I said, negotiations are underway with several countries specifically on this issue. It is an international outrage that people are allowed to escape war zones all over the world, in Ukraine, in Syria, in other war zones, but only in Gaza does the world seem to insist, no. In this small piece of land, Gazans must stay. Gazans and allow Hamas to use them as human shields.
Perhaps
that
because
is
of the occupation that's been there for quite such a long time.
Okay, so once again, Israel withdrew from Gaza 20 years ago.
And now you have how many
I
divisions
witnessed
there
it myself.
at the moment?
Israel withdrew from Gaza for 20 years ago, and Gaza was set up as a large terrorist base. We're saying never again.
Absolutely right, David, as will be agreed. Now, as you will know, we've spoken to Matt Miller, former spokesperson for the US State Department, who said to our Mark Stone that he feels that without doubt, war crimes have been committed by the Israelis in Gaza. How do you respond to that?
Well, Israel has been very, very close with our US allies, and indeed we've thanked President Biden, the former president, but also President Trump and his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, for their consistent support in the tireless efforts to release our hostages. Of course, when there are claims like that, they need to be fairly investigated. But I can tell you that Israel upholds the highest levels of international law. It is key to the IDF strategy in releasing our hostages and destroying this terrorist organization.
David, Martin Griffiths, former UN humanitarian chief, has described the situation in Gaza as genocide. He said it's unequivocal. Of course, what's happening in Gaza is genocide, and he's not the only one. The Irish government have described it as genocide too. Amnesty International as well, the humanitarian group, described it as genocide. The former EU foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, also described what's happening in Gaza as genocide and ethnic cleansing. How do you work for a government that is being described as carrying out acts in this way?
I work for this government with pride, because we are defending our nation. And this false charge of genocide, which you all there know to be false, this false charge, this modern-day blood libel. You know, they used to say that Jews killed Christian children to use their blood to make our Passover unleavened bread. These days, they say that Israel is committing a genocide, and that leads to real attacks on Jews. Real attacks on Jews. There was one in Colorado just a couple of days ago, and just in the last couple of weeks, that dreadful attack on two workers at the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. There is one way to end this war tomorrow. Hamas must release every one of our hostages, lay down its arms, surrender. Until then, we will keep fighting with pride, in accordance with international law, with force and with principle. Because we believe in humanitarian principles. You, unfortunately, have decided to side
cast aspersions.
with. Yes, I will cast aspersions. You have decided to side with a terrorist organization.
David, you and I
Shame
will
on
speak
you.
again, okay? David Mencer, the spokesperson of the Israeli government. Plenty more to come